Welcome to this episode of the Customer-Centric Retailing Podcast, a forum for retail leaders to discuss industry trends, challenges, and opportunities.
This is Anil.
And this is Fabi, and each episode we invite some of the brightest minds in the industry to discuss the future of customer centricity, with topics ranging from the rise of e-commerce to brick-and-mortar operations, to omni-channel technology to retail culture, and how all of these elements come together to create customer-centric retailing. Today we have with us Greg Buzek, founder and president of IHL Group and one of the founders of the Retail Orphan Initiative. Welcome to the podcast, Greg. It's a pleasure having you on. How are you doing today?
It's great to be here, Fabiana. Thanks for having me.
Fantastic. Well, there's so much for us to talk to you about today, but just to start us off, can you walk us through just your background a little bit so our audience is familiar?
Sure. I've got a really interesting start to my career and how it launched. I was actually hired originally in corporate intelligence, so I was like a corporate spy as my first job at NCR back in the late 90s. And that was very fortunate because where most people learn a single company and they learn all about that company, I was forced to learn the entire industry as a result. So I spent 2 or 3 years working in that side of the business, and then I got an opportunity to be a product manager for point of sale terminals. And I had two roles. One was to discontinue a very successful product that they had. But the second one was far more interesting and impactful as of today. I was the guy that introduced Wi-Fi into retail as a technology for point of sale. It was really a solution to asbestos. So I was the product manager on that and led that launch there when I was at NCR. Then I left there in 1993, went to a company called Sensormatic Electronics, and just was very fortunate to work as a product manager there on a product that was at the tipping point of the industry for source tagging. And the product that deactivates loss prevention tags when you leave the store. And through a lot of miraculous events, that ended up being a $100 million product and things there. So one of the things that I really wasn't a really good product manager. I was really very fortuitous there. But what I was pretty good at is understanding what data didn't exist in the marketplace that would be helpful to people that were developing products. And in 1996 started IHL, really as an arm's length analyst firm to begin to look at what the market would look like with a new product in the marketplace. What's realistic of what you could capture from a market share standpoint. And over time, the people we worked with that gave us a break, they all grew up, they all got promoted and positions and things like that. And as a result, that helped our business grow. And we're 25 years old now. So.
Awesome. That's such an interesting background. I think, a lot of people in the retail industry, when we ask them about their background, they typically have the, started on in the store floor and high school kind of story of how they entered retail. And yours is, of course, a lot more tech driven and really interesting. So a lot for us to dig into. The first question we wanted to ask you really is related to retail success in the pandemic. Because you recently posted a study on your LinkedIn that was all about what made for success. Was it e-commerce or was it actually stores? So can you go into a little bit more detail into that, what your view was there and what you think the key to success has been for retailers during the pandemic?
Well, during the pandemic, it was really about having supply and being associated as a essential retailer. I mean, that's literally what success was. The government told everybody who was going to be successful. Now, that was great for supermarkets, for mass merchants, for big box retailers that were open that sell multiple categories. It was devastating for small retailers. We had the largest transfer of wealth ever in retail during the pandemic. We saw upwards of $285 billion worldwide shift from general merchandise clothing type retailers to people that sold food and had also sold clothes as a part of that. But the most devastating piece was the fact that we saw this massive transfer of wealth from small companies to large companies. The large companies were allowed to stay open. The small boutiques and those restaurants and stuff were closed. And we lost close to 400,000 small retailers in the U.S. alone due to pandemic regulations. So the number one thing that determined success was I sold food and I was a big retailer. And the governments during the pandemic said, yes, you're going to do that. But the second thing is I had visibility into my supply chain and I could stack the products and watch them fly. So it used to be that 2 years ago, everything was about personalization and personalizing the experience for the customer, and everybody didn't want to be Walmart and they didn't want to be Amazon. And then all of a sudden the pandemic happened and it was all about, stack them high and watch them fly. If you had toilet paper, if you had inventory, you were slammed and you got Christmas every day for about 3 weeks. And that continued for a long period of time there. The second thing is the people that had been investing in their multi-channel business, particularly multi-channel fulfillment, and the other thing was contactless payment at the point of sale, for instance, were far ahead of everybody else when it came to being able to capture those sales and do it safely and effectively. And when it comes to the contactless payment side, those people had already passed the process of going through PCI compliance for those new terminals. So when everybody came in and they didn't want to touch anything, they were already ready, and everybody else was still waiting to get certified to be able to do that. So those were the biggest reasons why people were successful during the pandemic. Um, but there's various levels of success there in terms of who was most successful. And I mean, we're talking crazy volumes. When we looked at the first quarter here in the U.S. between Sam's and Costco of last year, so the pandemic surge was 2 week period. Okay, during that 2 week period, Costco slowed down people coming into the stores and did social distancing for 2 weeks. Sam's only did it for 1 week. The difference was 5 points growth for the quarter in same store sales. Five 5 points higher for Sam's than Costco in the first quarter because Costco limited customers coming in. You saw the same thing with Lowe's and Home Depot. Lowe's was about 5 points higher in same store sales for the quarter, for the whole 3 month period because of that. And that just gives you an idea of just the incredible volumes that were happening during that period of time. And yet your typical fashion retailer was shut down completely for months. Um, and so that's where you get back. It's a long answer for, the government determined who was successful or not, or the virus determined that in the reaction to the virus. But some were even more successful than others during that short period of time.
Yeah, I think what you mentioned at the beginning in particular is really interesting because while the pandemic has been devastating for many companies, it's been particularly devastating for small businesses and again, those non-essential businesses too. And so we all know that big retailers always have an advantage, especially in the digital age. They have more money to spend, they have more people. But how do you think small retailers can remain competitive in this hyper-competitive environment? Is there a way?
Oh, absolutely. And the small retailers that survived, it depends on the segment. So I think it's really important to identify those that are in food, certainly those who are in HBC products, cannabis products, etc., did extremely well during the pandemic there. The clothing boutiques that were there, they were shut down for their walk-in business, but those who were able to pivot were able to survive and get through there. Where the biggest devastation happened were those who could not pivot to an online presence in the clothing area and the restaurants that were forced to shut down there. We lost in certain, if on the East Coast in particular, lost 30% of the restaurants on the East Coast of the United States because of the pandemic there. There was never a worse time to own a restaurant associated with that. Now, there's never been a better time than right now to open one because we have the tsunami of demand. Everybody's getting out. Everybody wants to go out to eat with their friends, and we've got all this demand, and we don't have enough labor. We don't have enough restaurants and stuff to meet that demand there. Around the world, it's quite a bit different because of the way the rest of the world generally handled the government stimulus. They tried to prevent the unemployment that we saw here in the U.S., which was a massive jump and then a big drop. And what they did is they essentially paid 80% of the salaries for the small businesses and just said stay home during that time. which was great in a short period of time, but they didn't provide multiple levels of stimulus payments to consumers to incentivize to go out. So generally, gen- generally the rest of the world has has less disposable income for dining out and all those functionalities anyway. However, if you now go a year into the pandemic, when we did a consumer study and look at the rest of the world, when it comes to those discretionary categories, well, they have 20% less money than they had before. So when you think of travel, dining, eating out, all those sort of discretionary categories, it's a U.S. phenomenon right now because of three, four rounds of stimulus money that's come in there. So
Yeah, it's been interesting to see in general just how different governments have reacted and how the way that they've reacted economically has impacted the retail industry because certainly every country has had a slightly different approach and the US very different from Europe. So it'll be interesting to see how that recovery plays out now that, everyone's kind of reopening.
and it really has nothing to do with how well you did at keeping people alive. Korea and Japan were fabulous at the pandemic and keeping people alive during this period of time. Their numbers are some of the worst when it comes to actually economic growth coming out of the pandemic because of the fact that the elongated nature of it and the lack of stimulus for those folks. When it comes to like travel, for instance, the South Koreans were a minus 44% budget going for the next year in that, whereas in the United States, it's a plus 50 in some cases. So just shows you that difference in nature, government reaction, how they responded, et cetera, had a big impact on things.
Absolutely, and there's still so much unknown and uncertainty in a lot of different places in the world with, continued spikes or, depending on the vaccination rollout. So it'll definitely be interesting to continue to watch. I wanted to ask you because a lot of retailers invested heavily in retail tech over the course of the pandemic out of necessity, as you had mentioned. So, they moved to e-commerce. You had mentioned the importance of having supplies, so they made sure that they could use their stores as warehouses, which they had never done before. They did BOPIS. So, do you see that trend persisting now that we're kind of coming out on the other side and people are, coming back into stores? Do you see those omni-channel experiences like buy online, pickups in store, and fulfill from store continuing, or were people just pushed into it and they're going to go back to the way they were doing things?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and I think you almost have to look at the segments and what's involved there in terms of response and where the technology is being rolled out. It's all about that fulfillment of digital orders. The average retailer that had not optimized that process lost between 3 and 8 points of margin on every order because of things like out of stocks. They didn't know how to deal with that. They had people running around. They couldn't find where their inventory was. It just the supply wasn't there. They had to wait for the customer to accept a substitute product, et cetera. They didn't have mobile devices. The printer was over here for the receipt. All those kind of things weren't optimized. But it varies per segment in terms of the response. We are in an extraordinary opportunity and time of investment in technology as a result of the pandemic, particularly around everything that's contactless, touchless, or related to digital fulfillment of orders. The biggest headwinds we have is we don't have enough labor and we don't have enough product because of chip shortages right now. So it's a big challenge in getting there. So if I was to go segment by segment, if I look at what we would call the food, drug, convenience, mass merchant category, it's all about touchless. So tons of self-checkout, tons of electronic shelf labels. Electronic shelf labels are a 20-year-old technology that's an overnight success because of the pandemic. 843% increase in deployments in the next 2 years as a result of that. Now, part of that is because they don't have the labor to do it, and the unions are giving them a pass when they've been holding and pushing back on it for a long time. The second thing, though, is they can dynamically price against Amazon and Walmart now with the electronic shelf labels and couldn't do that before. So, contactless payment, more self service, using the consumer shopping on their own phones, leveraging all that technology, which cuts down labor. The second thing in that area is we have got to get to a single inventory for our online orders. We can't have walk-in shoppers competing with the online shoppers for the same thing on the shelf because that's a disaster. And so they're going to these separate sections within the store, micro fulfillment centers that may or may not be automated, where the top 5,000 items, let's say in a supermarket, are in separate inventories in a section of the store where walking customers can't touch it. So they have accurate inventory. It's in a confined space. They can quickly respond and fulfill orders there. So that's that group. When it comes to your general merchandise stores, most of the volume, because of the speed of fast fashion driving the market, most of that inventory is in local stores for e-commerce, regardless of how it's shipped or whether it's local or across the country there. That technology is around, hey, do I actually have that size 8 black cocktail dress in my store? And where is it in my store? They can't afford to have separate locations and inventory there, but they do need to know that it's in the dressing room or it's on the wrong rack, et cetera. So technologies like computer vision and RFID are really, really big there. And they're now rolling out the contactless payment side of things there. But it's once again, it's how do I know what I have to be able to deliver? How do I do things in terms of pricing during the period of time where, hey, full price, and then I start to discount it as I go around through the season? How do I do that and optimize my margin through that? All of those technologies are in play right now for that group. And interestingly enough, when you get to hospitality, RFID comes back again, but it's not so much as an inventory technology, but more as a contact tracing and a payment technology for the guests. So it's a way of knowing who was in contact with somebody else. Can they use it as touchless payment for things, but then they can track them around the properties, whether it's a ship, whether it's a resort, whether it's a theme park, they're able to do that. And then when it comes to things like restaurants, it's all about the mobile apps right now in optimizing that drive through. There are many fast food restaurants who have never opened up their dining rooms again, even though they've been allowed to because so much traffic has come through their mobile apps. There's a Chick-fil-A in Florida that has 4 lanes now for drive-through and pickup, and they've never reopened their dining room, and they've been able to do that since like I think June of last year. Been able to be open, but they never reopened it because they got so much volume coming through those drive-throughs. So you see a lot of drive-throughs now where there are associates outside with headsets. They're taking the payment. They're doing that well before the window um, normally would be where they would place the order there. So a lot of things related to mobile apps, incentivizing customers through that, and processing those folks through that. McDonald's has got an entire AI drive-through now, where there's no person behind the actual ask at the podium there at the board. So each one of those is a little bit different, but it they general has a general theme. It's optimizing the online orders, there the most, and then removing labor and optimizing the process for those walk-in shoppers that come back to the stores.
Wow, Greg, it feels like we are going through like a real big change, as if it's like we were like nothing in terms of. It feels like when you are saying all these things, it feels like we've been doing pretty much nothing at the technology level, and now the world is going to be only tech. If you don't know tech, then pretty much cannot actually do anything. And also it means that everything will be re-engineered, so it's like a really really big undertaking for our society. And I'm thinking about all those retailers or small businessmen who've been doing business for many years, where the item existed if it was on the shelf, and you sold it if it was on the shelf. So that's where it was. The whole inventory was on your in your mind in real time, and the selling was happening against the physical presence and visual context and all that. And now looks like people who've been doing business, good old business for last 30-40 years, for them it's going to be big change. I don't know how they're going to keep up. It's going to be a really challenging times coming out of this pandemic for the businessmen who at their mindset they are like, I'm a self-employed, I'm a businessman. But now onwards, I think our society is at a risk of getting, having many of these people who are like go-getters, but actually would feel helpless because they don't really understand the technology as much. So it's going to be a challenging time for our society.
It certainly is, and I think you've got micro businesses, and a lot of those micro businesses are seasonal or they're location based businesses, and they're dependent on the crowds. Um, that's going to come back at some point. We tend to be creatures of the moment and think, oh, nobody's going to travel, nobody's going to come back, we're not going to, have events and bazaars and all this sort of stuff. But when you think about it, that is going to come back. So that micro business is going to be there. I think one area where you look at it, that yeah, you have to have an online presence and you have to do something is related to restaurants. If you're a restaurant that says no, we don't take reservations, you are going to just not going to be able to deal with the demand and the walk-in customers and the crush of that's coming and is already there. So you have call ahead seating, you have reservations, but I think the trend's going to be you have reservations that have a penalty if you don't show up. That's a reservation with a credit card if you want that slot, because you need to be able to staff. You need to know what that demand is. The demand is well beyond what you can handle, and you can't have 1,000 people showing up at your restaurant, unannounced, anymore. It's just not possible there. And otherwise, you're talking 3 4 hour waits to get a meal, and then everybody's hanging around outside and all that sort of thing. So that's the one area where I just think if you haven't gone to more automation and online stuff and pre-reservations, you're in real trouble. You know, for most merchants, when it's just neighborhoods and they're providing food, and they're the local bodega and things like that, their world's not going to change that much, other than the fact that their audience, if it's more work from home rather than coming back to a central office district, there, I think that's where the real thing is do you have the customers coming in, let alone the technology. So I think it's vastly different by the type of thing, and it's really more about, is the customer volume in the area, or have we gone back to an area where everybody's going to be working from home, related to that. So
To your point, Greg, I'm based out of London right now, and coming out of the lockdown, I think every restaurant I've made a reservation in the past couple of weeks has had that credit card requirement, and it's a pretty hefty fee if you don't show up. So I do think that's going to continue becoming more and more popular because of the extreme demand, and everybody wants to go, and you need to be able to have that visibility. I think, we've been talking so much about how small businesses need to keep up, but realistically, big box retailers also need to keep up. I was just having a conversation with Anil about his big shopping spree this weekend, and he was going to some big box retailers, and he was disappointed by the lack of tech enablement that he saw in the stores. And he was like, "Wow, this is one of the biggest retailers in the world, and their staff isn't well equipped. They don't understand what technology they have." I know that you mentioned RFID technology, and we did a whole episode on that because that's such a gap right now. Retailers don't know what they have in store. Someone has to go in the back and check. So I'm curious, why do you think that these huge big box retailers that definitely have the resources to invest in tech and invest in their people, why aren't they doing it more?
well, they are. It's more like I said. You've got the limitation of the availability of the product. I mean, we cannot divorce the supply chain issues, the supply chain for the product, but also supply chain for the technology that's holding back a lot of these implementations. That's the biggest challenge that they're facing with a lot of this stuff, is they just don't have the visibility, they don't have the insight, because there are 3 weeks worth of ships off the coast trying to get unloaded, and they're not getting unloaded there. They've got the customers that want to buy. They're struggling to get the people that want to work to fill the stores there. The technology is there, but there's a limitation on how much you can get rolled out. I mean, if you're talking a big box retailer with 1,000 stores, it's really hard to get that kind of volume of product during this chip shortage right now to roll out because everybody wants it right now. Um, Looking forward on that, the biggest issue going forward, the battle is the supply chain, and it's the same as it was prior to the pandemic. It's about who can get the accurate inventory first and start applying AI and machine learning to that accurate inventory. The thing that's slowing it down right now is the success of AI and machine learning and all those forecasts and stuff is completely predicated on whether that data is clean and accurate. Otherwise, you're just making forecasts faster on bad data. And so they're struggling with that piece of it is to just, does the data we have and the insight we have, is that correct? Um, and then it's, can I get access to the supply necessary to do it? But like I said, for the last 15 months, it's all been about is whether the product's on the shelf or not. That's your success criteria wise, is that. It really had nothing to do with did I have the handheld or did I have the app per se for the last 15 months. It's moving to that, but it's like this problem where we've got this huge glut of demand, but we don't have the supply yet to be able to meet that demand. And one of the challenges in most parts of the world, the areas locked down the most are the areas that have the ports. So when you think of the U.S., it's Long Beach, it's California, it's New York, it's New Jersey. Those are the ports that the where the entire society was locked down the longest. You think of London, in terms of the UK. You think of Amsterdam, in terms of Europe there. Um, locked down longer than anybody, just about anybody else. And so all of that plays a role for things there.
Yeah, it's definitely been a very challenging time to be in retail, and I think another thing that makes it that much more challenging is this hyper competitive nature. And I think for right now, retailers really need to cut through the noise and create kind of a novel and exciting customer experience because there's so many options. So how do you attract someone to your retail location or to your brand? So I'm curious if there are any brands or maybe trends that you've been watching of things that really do stand out, or you think a brand that's doing a really great job at that.
Yeah, it's interesting. Everybody talks about customer experience, and we're seeing the personalization desire to come back. But that personalization is more around the app and it's around the offers that you're being, incentivized with to come into the store. I really love what Sam's is doing. Their Scan and Go app is by far the best in the industry. Um, there, you can go at the busiest time of day and go in and get three, four, five items, whatever you want to do, and walk right out the door. As long as they've got enough people checking the door, there's literally no wait getting out the door with that. Other people have tried, like Walmart still makes you go to a self-checkout device. Well, on a Saturday afternoon, that's fruitless because it's packed related to that. I know in Europe you've got some folks that they use a scan. You pick up a scanner and you walk around, and then you got to go back to a kiosk to finalize it. You're still creating these queues and these lines associated with that. The winners, I believe, are going to be the ones who say, I've got trusted customers who want to check out on their phone. They're bringing their own bags. They don't want to be dealing with lines of people there. Um, and I'm going to take the risk that if they put their credit card on file, I've got their customer history, I'm tracking them throughout the store and everything that they're doing. I'm going to take the loss prevention risk on those customers because those are going to be my best customers to begin with. Those are generally not the people that are ripping you off. And for those customers, that's a great customer experience. For others, it's related to assisted selling and that interaction with the associate and the personalization through there. We've got this balance though between privacy and and customer service when it comes to things. So if a Neil was researching a new laptop on his local electronics retailer, super big box electronics retailer, and he walked in the store and it knew from his research online, it knew he was there, but it also knew from his phone that that's a Neil, and it could send an alert to an associate that he's been looking at the high-end laptops there. He doesn't start him at the $299 laptop discussion when he gets there. He starts the discussion there. And maybe a better example would be camera lenses. If he's looking at a $2,500 camera lens, you don't start him off with a point and shoot camera there. And being able to do that in a way that's not creepy, but in a way that's really custom there. So if a Neil came in and I got an alert saying that a Neil's in here, he's been looking at the Canon, to whatever full frame camera body is like $3,000 worth thing. When I ask him when he comes, I'm going to ask him questions about what kind of pictures does he take. What's he really look? Is he looking for sports? Is he looking for wildlife? Is he looking for that sort of thing? I'm going to feed into that piece of him that lets him geek out about that purchase there, and we can have that conversation and personalize it that way. In that way, you would never want to do that in a Walmart. You would never want to do that in a Tesco, or Auchan or someplace like that. But you would in an electronics store. But you've got to figure out how do you do that and manage the privacy piece around that. And I think that's the part that's so fascinating with some of these technologies is the local rules, the ethical rules related to some of the decisions that are being made off of that technology. Is it a visual technology? Am I making assumptions based on somebody's race or gender or whatever? Am I making those assumptions, or am I making a mistake by doing that? Do I leverage that kind of technology in some way? Those are all these decisions that are having to be made, and a lot of them get pushed to the side because there's just so much other low-hanging fruit that we've got to deal with right now in terms of just basic supply chain efficiencies and store efficiency issues that are there. Because that stuff, as I talked earlier about the margin loss on those orders. If I fix that, that is profit that 100% of the time drops right to the bottom line. If I'm trying to identify whether this person is this ethnicity or this gender or whatever, it may or may not work. I'm going to push that to the side for now.
Yeah, there is definitely such a fine line between privacy and security, as you say, and there's all sorts of questions that come up when we start talking about that, about bias in artificial intelligence and how this tech is constructed, and so you can really go down a rabbit hole in that direction. But I think to your larger point, the more frictionless you can make that shopping experience for whoever your customer is and whatever they're looking to do, that's really the key, I think, to success right now. To pivot a little bit, though, we want to make sure to ask you about Retail Orphan because that's a charitable foundation that I know that you're very passionate about. So tell us a little bit more about why you do and why it's important. I think our audience would be really happy to hear about that.
Yeah, for me, it's a calling to do. The most vulnerable in our society are kids that are orphans. They're far more likely to be trafficked. A kid that is in the state system, if they're lucky to be in a state system around the world, is like 75 to 80% to be either pregnant, in jail, or dead by the time they age out of foster care. Um, there and there's millions and millions of these kids. It's estimated there's 150, 140 to 150 million of these kids worldwide. And so what retail ROI is a bunch of people in the industry that do three things. We help raise awareness to the needs. Two, we leverage our skill sets to make a difference and by coming alongside charities that are doing work. So for instance, we needed a kitchen for a school of 650 kids. We had a vice president of Schlotsky's go to suppliers and donate one piece of equipment each. And we were able to put $1 million kitchen into that school for $65,000 because we leveraged our networks to do that. We were able to feed those kids for a year because we had somebody at Cargill who donated corn, somebody else who bagged it up, and then somebody else that bought the container and shipping and did the shipping and logistics and FDA inspection, et cetera. So for $7,500, we fed 600 people for a year as a result of that. And then the third thing is raising funding to where we can double, triple, or quadruple the work. Because when we add our expertise along with a little bit of funding, we can build schools, computer labs, et cetera, like that. So with Retail ROI, it's just people like you and me in the industry that have just gotten together. and partnered with great charities, and then lend our skill sets to that and joined boards and participated with that. And in 12 years, we believe we've helped close to 250,000 children around the world have a better life as a result of that.
That's amazing work, and again, we really recommend to our audience to check that out and become involved and help with the fundraising in particular because it's a very important cause. We thank you so much for joining us today, Greg. It's been such a pleasure speaking with you, and I'm sure our audience enjoyed getting to know you. Is there anything new and exciting kind of happening in your life or your business in the next couple of months that you'd like to give us a sneak peek into?
Yeah,
Just
I mean, the key things that we're looking at right now, two big trends right now that we're looking at. One is that fulfillment side of things, and the automated and the micro fulfillment side of it. It's the ability to dramatically reduce that cost. So we're in the process of a study right now on that. The second one is all around what we call dark stores or dark restaurants, which is a brand. There's a physical, but it's an e-commerce restaurant. There is no physical place where you can come and sit down. And it's the rise of those things, and what are the characteristics about those organizations, and then how does that merge with retail? So, like for instance, Walmart now has one with dark stores where or dark kitchens in there where they've got, instead of just one restaurant that you see when you walk in, they've got like 6 or 7 restaurants, and you can just place your order, and as you're leaving the store, you just pick up your salad, or whether it's a sub, or your Asian dish, whatever, that is the same restaurant quality as if you went and sat down somewhere. So there's this merging infusion of that. So, but it's not a physical location where people go sit down, etc. But it's to meet that demand for the food.
there are definitely so many interesting trends to watch within the retail industry. I know that you're on the forefront of that as well, and so there are so many different things that we could talk to you about today. We had to pick just a couple, but again, thank you so much for your time and for being on the Customer Centric Retailing podcast today.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Thanks, Greg. Yeah.
All right, we'll see you guys.
See you. Bye.
That's it for this episode of the Customer Centric Retailing podcast featuring our special guest, Greg Buzek. Greg's professional background provides him with a unique view into the retail industry, one that focuses on the data and technology needed in order to provide the best experience possible for the consumer. He is also one of the founders of the Retail Orphan Initiative, a wonderful charitable organization that you can get involved in at www.retailroi.com. If you like what you heard, you can subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and Google Podcasts. Please rate and review and recommend to a friend or fellow retail fanatic. This podcast is brought to you by Hot Wax Commerce.